I'm JG Michael, and this is Parallax Views. This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mersham, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Sadeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. As always, I want to remind you that if you appreciate the work here I do at Parallax Views, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. I need your support to keep this show going. I do not have any advertisers or sponsors. This show is entirely listener supported. So if you appreciate the work I do here at Parallax Views and the eclectic mix of topics that I cover, please consider donating to my Patreon page. On this edition of the program, we have a double feature. Later on in the program, we'll be hearing from Antiwar.com's Dave DeCamp to give us some Syria news. But first, we're speaking with returning guest. He's becoming something of a regular on this program, Patrick Theros of the National Herald, a former U.S. ambassador to Qatar, I believe from 1995 to 1998. He's an American diplomat with a lot of knowledge about international relations, and we're going to be talking about the U.S. economy, Syria, Israel, the Ukraine-Russia conflict, Turkey, the future of Europe, and more amidst the incoming second Trump administration. I won't say much more than that, as I think you just need to listen to the conversation. It's a rather fascinating and, in my view, insightful conversation with Ambassador Theros, as it always is. But I think that this specific discussion with Ambassador Theros provides a lot of food for thought to chew on. So with that being said, let's get right to it with Ambassador Patrick Theros.
All right.
A 3, 2, 1. Welcome back to Parallax Views. One of my frequent and favorite guests, Ambassador Patrick Theros. You can read his work at the National Herald, a great Greek publication, Greek-American publication. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, and thanks for the flattery. It always works.
Well, I wanted to have you back on to just discuss the, what's in store for us with a Trump victory. But I also, just to start out, wanted to ask you your thoughts on what we've seen transpire in the past few days in the Middle East.
That was truly amazing. Weekend. I was in Doha for the weekend, attending the Doha Forum. It's an annual event. And the only topic of conversation was what happened in Syria.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty incredible.
The answer was we had 1,000 questions and 1,000 wrong answers to them.
Fair enough. I think it's a moment where we're going to have to wait and see what happens.
Absolutely.
In terms of why I initially had you on, you wrote this piece, How Did the GOP Become MAGA, and What Happens If It Wins? And it has won. So
Right.
What's your basic assessment of Trump's victory, and what do you think we're going to be seeing in the second Trump administration?
I'm more confident about the first question than I am about the second one. First one, and I think I mentioned that in my article pretty much, is the Democrats pretty much missed what people were most concerned about. I also, there is a possibility as well that when they pushed to get out the vote, the people who came out to vote were non-voting Trump supporters. The They were the ones who got the message more than the non-voting Democrats did. And say it's the Republicans focused on the fact that the Democratic focus was on narrow niche issues, and you can pile up niche issues. Whereas the Republicans went all in on basically bread costs $1.50, and last year, 2 years ago, it cost $1, or whatever the price was. And I think they had a much simpler message to sell. And it was a message that resonated probably more than anything else. I don't think the message on woke resonated very much. I don't think the transgender issues resonated very much with either side, frankly. Uh, and abortion was the only large audience issue that the Democrats had, but it wasn't big enough to overcome the consequences of inflation. And an utter failure on their part, this I do not understand, an utter failure on their part to try and at least explain why Biden's economic policies were good in the long run.
I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Like, what do you think? I mean, I know you don't have necessarily special knowledge, but
Mhm.
why do you think the Democrats mishandled this election?
I don't know. I have a friend who's pretty high up in the party and is about to tear his hair out. And he said Democrats hired too many consultants. And each of the consultants they hired was a specialist in something. And the consultant pushed that item that he was a specialist in. And it has some reverberation. If you remember in 2016, uh, the state committees in Illinois, I'm not in Illinois, in Wisconsin and Michigan, were begging for Hillary to come out there. And somebody had computer programs that showed, no, don't worry, we got those states wrapped up. And I think uh, the Democrats have got to start going back to uh, the old-fashioned cigar smoke-filled rooms to at least do their planning and involve politicians rather than consultants with computers in their planning. Um, and Trump, I have to say, is a genius at reading his audience,
I
and
wanted
he
to delve
did.
into that a bit more because you said that in your article, you said he did appeal to the legitimate grievances of, say, trade unionists. Can you talk about where he did actually appeal to real grievances people had, and you know, your assessment of that?
Okay. First one was simply inflation. And people, unfortunately, associate inflation not with the rates. I mean, this is where the wonks come in. Policy wonk comes in and says last month we had 9% inflation rate. Now we got 3% inflation rate. That doesn't mean anything. A dropping inflation rate doesn't mean anything. The only thing that means anything, it's quite simple, was this is what I paid last month, and and this is what I'm paying this month for the same commodity. And unless you go into depression, prices aren't ever going to go back. So you have to be pitching a positive message of, well, we have, we're doing this and we're doing that. Uh, I think, for example, both sides ignored healthcare, and this is someplace that Democrats had something to talk about that they didn't really talk about. Uh, there are several issues out there, Climate change is, to me, the single most important issue they should be talking about, but they're not, and not enough, frankly. And I'm not even sure it can be sold to all but the more sort of laid back, sophisticated audiences. Climate change is something that's going to come in. We're going to see the really bad halfway through the century, and by then it'll be too late. But it's very hard to explain to somebody that he's ignoring a problem that his grandson's going to have to deal with. Yeah. Anyway, so the Democrats got a little bit too much consultant, too much specialization, too much dealing from the point of view of the expert on a subject, rather than getting down to where people voted really are, and they just ignored it.
In terms of your article on MAGA, I know you and I were exchanging emails about the issue of populism. Um,
Right.
and you said to me, listen, there's never been a populism that has really delivered. Populist leaders have, at best, sort of failed or become like extreme autocrats. Do you want to talk a
Right.
little bit about that?
Yeah. Populism promises instant solutions, and there are very, very few problems that lend themselves to instant solutions. So halfway through the term of a very populist president, for example, uh, it's going to become obvious that he has no solution. He may have, kicked a few things around, but he has no solution. And at the end, he's either got to retain power by illegal means or he's got to lose an election. Trump actually did both at the end of his first term. Um, my one surviving uh, liberal cousin in northeastern Ohio told me that uh, one of the things that caused his county to actually vote for Biden was that Trump came into the county, spent a lot of time talking about infrastructure, and then said he would reopen a car plant that had closed, and the plant somebody new came in, reopened the plant, and then went bankrupt in a year and closed it again. And in that part of the country, fixing rail lines, fixing bridges, fixing all these things is really important, and he didn't deliver. Uh, and had he had delivered, what I think Trump understood was that politicians love in opening ceremonies, the new bridge. There's no for the populist politician, there's no reward for fixing the potholes. You can't go out. He needs drama to do these things, and drama involves actually finishing the bridge, getting getting our own what is it system in progress means you say, okay, I need a bridge from A to B. That's next to it is a bridge that's falling apart. You could probably fix the bridge that's falling apart in a year or two during your term, but there's no real ceremony there's no drama to fixing a bridge. The drama is cutting the ribbon for the new bridge. Well, the new bridge requires, 2 years of design, 2 years of permitting, 2 years of competing, plus all the people that have complained the competition wasn't fair, and then 2 more years to finish. Well, at that point, you're down to the third term. And that just doesn't pay off for populist politicians. So they have to go around looking for cheap victories. And they can't produce what they promised within a reasonable time frame. And it's not their fault they can't, it's just that's the way the system works. So Trump, in effect, lost the election and tried to stay on illegally. He tried to
You mean
become
in 2020? Yeah.
yeah, 2020, yeah, 2020. He did both. I mean, he almost, He attempted to do both. He failed didn't win the election, claimed he got robbed, and then uh, staged the resurrection and tried to seize the Capitol.
In terms of what are your biggest concerns going forward with the second Trump administration?
Um,
I mean, other than just my big concern is it's going to be a kakistocracy, government by incompetence and just chaos.
well, I mean, I'm sort of down at two concerns. Concern number one is that he actually tries to do something to change the system and keep him in power. Uh, and that is a distant concern. I'm trying to figure out how he can do it, uh, short of persuading the an armored brigade to take over the city, which I don't see happening. I don't see anybody in the U.S. military down to captain level even thinking of a coup d'état. I've spent a lot of time around the U.S. military, and they are the most apolitical military that I've ever seen. Having dealt with the militaries of 8, 10 countries, they are literally the most apolitical military I've ever seen in the United States, which is one of its strengths. And try as he might, I mean, Hegseth is going to try really hard to to do something about that, to fix it so that the military is not only political, but it's loyal. There's two things wrong with that. Hegseth was in the National Guard, and that's not the real military. He doesn't know how the real military works. He's going to do, if he does what he says he wants to do, is he's going to cause the military to hate him and do everything possible to undermine him. Matter of fact, if I were seriously thinking of using the military uh, to advance my political fortunes, the first thing I would do is make sure Hegseth isn't my Secretary of Defense. I think this guy uh, will make the military hate him and hate the president. Okay, my big concerns are two: is we're not going to get around inflation. If Trump does half of what he promised to do, the inflation rate's going to go right back up
You
again.
mean with the tariffs?
The tariffs, the tax cuts, expelling immigrants, they're all working at cross purposes. Uh, if you expel immigrants, it means you don't have enough workers to make things internally, so you can't have tariffs. You can keep immigrants and tariffs. But if you get rid of the immigrants, you can't have tariffs because immigrants build things. I mean, 9/10 of the immigrants that are illegally in the United States are contributing to my Social Security. Uh, they're paying into the system. The so those two things are at cross purposes. And the other thing is all the tax cuts he promised. I can't see twice the tariffs. Matter of fact, if he has twice the tariffs he promised, no one's going to export anything here, and no one's going to pay into the tariffs. So his whole economic plan doesn't work. Period. I mean, it's just I don't. What he can do is juice the economy through most of his term, so that everybody's feeling good because there's so much money coming in. But at some point, if he does anything except the tax cuts, if he does the tax cuts with either tariffs or with expelling immigrants, the economy is in serious trouble and will come back and bite him. My guess is uh, not everybody on his staff is very smart, but there's got to be somebody smart enough to go get his ear and say, why don't we just do the tax cuts? And by the time the inflation gets really out of hand, you'll run out of your term. And you can go home and live comfortably, and the devil take the hindmost. But otherwise, I think both the tariffs and the expelling of immigrants are going to be a serious blowback for him. You put 25% tariffs on Canada, and you just tank the American automobile industry. Put 25% tariffs on Mexico, and there goes the avocado and cream sandwich. Mexico producing 80% of the avocados we eat. And you can repeat this over and over again. Mexico actually sells more semi-finished goods to the United States than anything else.
I wanted to ask, when it comes to the discussions about immigration, I find it very taxing to even talk about the issue of immigration and immigrant workers because you would just hear, yeah, but they're illegal, and I'm like, well, if you want your cheap goods that
Yeah,
you seem to want, like you're gonna need cheap labor. And
right.
to be honest, I think it's sad that immigrants are exploited in that way as cheap
Yeah,
labor, but they're also getting a bargain in it too because it's
yeah.
a chance to
They're
live in
doing better
America,
than they did in
etc.
their home country. Yeah,
What's that?
they're doing better than they did in their home country. There's a reason they're coming here, even though it's cheap by our standards, and even though by our standards their living conditions are pretty bad. 9/10 of them have given up a much worse situation in their home country to do it. So, do I think there is exploitation? Like you, yeah. Uh, I don't think the immigrants would agree with you. It's only when they've been here a few years, they have kids, they get settled in, that they realize uh, that. See, the first 3 or 4 years, the immigrant's comparing his life to what he left behind. Sometime between the fourth and the eighth year, he's beginning to compare his life to the other guys he's working with, and uh, and by that time, most immigrants are entrepreneurial and they tend to work their way up the food chain.
The issue I have is less with that and more with like the way, as I said, the people who are on this, you know, we need to expel the undocumented immigrants kick. I don't know what to tell them because like it's going to impact them economically, and they seem to want to have their cake and eat it too. And I don't understand why certain Americans can't understand this. If you want your cheap goods, there's going to have to be cheap labor.
I think they don't believe it. I think it is simply uh, it, they just don't believe that that's true. They think I'm trying to, they think if I support more immigration, I'm trying to dilute American blood, or I'm trying to uh, create a bunch of voters who will only vote Democrat and turn this country into a permanently democratically ruled country. A lot of it simply there is, and I don't know why the United States is particularly susceptible to this, but it seems to be a Northern European phenomenon, actually, even a European phenomenon. This idea that this idea of purity, a pure culture, a pure religion, a pure blood. All these things seems to be a it exists elsewhere too. I suppose it's just more manifest, more apparent. You politicians can sell their constituents the idea of maintaining purity. Why don't we want, when I was a kid, we had segregated schools. Why did we have segregated schools? Because somebody didn't want his daughter marrying a black. It was about that simple at the time. It's just gotten more complicated now. I read a book about sort of the Irish Rebellion in New York, the 1840s, 1850s, the riots against the Irish. They were regarded they were regarded as people who would pollute your blood and take your religion away because they were Catholic. And it was that sort of uh, that sort of language that bothered them, not they weren't bothered by the economics. Economic argument was rarely made. And when it was made, it was twisted into, well, you're exploiting those poor folks, or you're causing me to lose my job because you're going to get a cheaper guy in. Though it didn't happen, you have to prove it empirically that it didn't happen, but it's very easy to make the statement, and the statement on the face of it sounds logical. Yeah. And, in logic, the apparent logic will always preempt the truth in an argument. What's interesting is the strongest anti-immigrant feelings seem to be felt in places that have no immigrants.
In terms of what do you think this means for Europe? Uh, because we talked in the past about, America is, whether this is for good or for both good and ill, taking a sort of anti-interventionist or isolationist turn.
Yeah.
So what does this mean for Europe? Because I think you were pointing this out before a lot of people were.
Yeah. Uh, I'm hoping there's a glimmer of hope that two things will happen. Is the Ukraine crisis is actually scaring just enough Europeans to start the ball rolling towards getting their act together as a continent, as an organization, to start doing things together. It's not enough yet, but it's a really big step. I've got a relative who in Greece that owns a company that produces some military components. And for the first time, there is a European defense fund to procure military equipment. And it got, the Hungarians were all mad about it until somebody reminded Orban that there's at least 3 factories in Hungary that would do really well under this bill. So he let it slip by. So that's on the positive side. The other thing is Trump may be able to claim a victory. He can say, at least a claimed victory. Fact is, European defense budgets are climbing. It used to be that the only country that had the same percentage of GDP devoted to defense as the United States was Greece, and Greece was doing it because of Turkey. Now, not only are most of the European countries above 2%, unfortunately, it doesn't include Germany, uh, but a number of them are up there with us at 3%. So if Trump wants an easy win, he can say, you see, I scare those SOBs into paying their way. And it's a fairly easy win, and he can just keep up. And from all appearances, Putin will do everything in his power to help Trump make that claim. He's scaring enough Europeans that their defense budgets are climbing. Defense cooperation has been put into a European document. The way that document works to ensure that the few big countries don't get all the contracts is that every bid for some project under this new defense fund must be presented by a JV of 3 companies in 3 different countries, and at least one of those countries has to be at sort of the bottom of the pile of defense production. So they've rigged it in a typically complicated European fashion. They've rigged it so that they are spreading the wealth, and more countries will be pitching in. And there's no reason, to be honest, there's no reason why the Europeans couldn't sustain higher defense budgets. But the bigger problem is getting the countries that have big defense industries to let the countries that don't have big ones have a piece of the pie. And that's the bigger problem in Europe. So now the negative development of the last 2 days was that when Assad fled the country, the next day, something between 15 and 20 European countries announced that they were suspending asylum applications by Syrians. And it was knee-jerk. It wasn't coordinated. It was just knee-jerk because it's so popular to go out against the new immigrants coming to Europe, the refugees coming to Europe. And it was a cheap political gesture that doesn't speak well for sort of the long-term thinking of European governments. It was their version of build the wall or something like that.
In terms of the other thing I think everyone is expecting with the second Trump term is the end of the conflict in Ukraine. What do you think that will entail? And where do you think people have been getting Ukraine wrong? Because, I still hear people, and I've even had guests on that will argue with me about Ukraine and say, well, the US shouldn't have done eastward expansion of NATO. But, I just look at it and I'm like, Russia invaded
Yeah.
Ukraine
I
and
mean,
is
yeah,
now demanding that it be able to annex certain territories. And for me, that's unacceptable.
it is. I mean, I'll tell you, I was one of those people who argued up to the Russians massing their forces outside Ukraine, who argued that we played this badly. Uh,
I think you could
Bush,
still argue that
yeah,
the
yeah,
eastward expansion was bad, but still, yeah.
yeah, yeah. But the Russians crossed the line. There are certain things you're not supposed to do, and one of them is send your tanks across the border to somebody else's country. And it was the Russian. It wasn't. How can I say this? It wasn't the appropriate Russian response to what we did. What we did was political and economic. And the Russians got a lot of smart people, and they should have approached it that way. Problem was, one of the negative side effects of what we did was create Putin. Putin wouldn't be where he is now if we hadn't moved NATO and the EU eastward. But he is. And you know what? We got a new reality. And the new reality is we did, and the Ukraine was trying to get ahead. Uh, we should have, hell, we shouldn't have just offered Ukraine EU membership. We should have offered Russia EU membership. A person who I think I blame for that one is Madeleine Albright, who, in the midst of the Yugoslav story, said that the U.S. would find it unacceptable for Russia. She said something like Russia has no place in either the EU or NATO. For why she chose to say that is a little bit of a mystery to me. But had the Russians pushed for EU membership, had the Russians saying, yeah, we don't mind the EU spreading eastward as long as it includes us as well. We want to be in the inside, not facing you. So if the Russians had played it that way, but Putin, I think, a smart, what's the word I'm looking for, guy in manipulating things, said his primary purpose was not to build Russia up. His primary purpose was to make himself boss of Russia completely. So in that way, the push eastward helped him. He made it an issue, but he never actually tried to solve it in a positive way. Never tried to solve the issue by saying, I'm going to stop complaining as long as you make it clear that Russia can join the EU. And I'm going to stop complaining as long as you can make it clear that Russia is a European country and I should be in NATO as well as anybody else should. And let the Europeans and the Americans come up with reasons why he shouldn't be invited in. We painted the Russians as enemies, and Putin, how can I say, he grabbed the paintbrush and slapped it on himself too, for his own domestic purposes.
So do you suspect that we will see the Ukraine conflict be ended during this presidency?
I can see several things happening, several different alternatives. I don't think Trump wants to look like a loser. And if he walks in and tells the Ukraine, guys, it's over, I'm cutting you off, cut the best deal you can, Putin's not going to let them cut the best deal they can. And I hope, but I actually think that Trump knows that this is the way this would happen. The Russians, in effect, would take over the whole of the Ukraine in some staged fashion. If the America just cut it off, because hard as the Europeans are trying to build their defense industry, they let theirs wither even more than we let ours. And they can't. This relative of mine who's in the, small piece of the arms industry, says they need 5 years to get back up to where they were in 1990 before they can get anywhere close to that. And in 1990, they were still smaller than what it needed to be, but they were at least capable of producing things. Now this guy is trying to expand. His biggest problem is skilled workers. He's got to go out and hire people that he let go in 1990 who can work on. So it takes time to rebuild the defense industry, and therefore the Europeans won't be able to fill in for us, no matter how hard they try and how much money they spend. Which then, and I think that will dawn on Trump. If he doesn't know it already, that will dawn on him pretty quickly. I think he will try to end the war as quickly as possible, holding out a threat of I'm going to rearm, I'm going to put all of American strength behind rearming Ukraine, and say that to Putin unless you agree to something reasonable. And then he's going to turn to Zelensky and say, see, I got you something reasonable, accept it even if Zelensky doesn't like it. I think this is at least where he's going. I'm not sure he can pull it off. And the reason I say he may not be able to pull it off is Putin is now so dead set against anything short of total victory that he matches Zelensky, whose political future involves the Ukrainian total victory. The two of them are now at this point where their minimum demands are far beyond the maximum demand, the minimum demands of the other side.
Right. They're both making maximalist demands from their own sort of ends.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's, I think, is the biggest obstacle to a peace process.
There were just two more questions I had. I know I have to let you get going after that, but I also wanted to ask you, what do you think the second Trump term will entail when it comes to I hope this isn't too out of left field, but Turkey, because I think that Trump has a very unique sort of dynamic with
Yeah,
Erdogan. So what do you think that could entail?
I think uh, I am more certain of what Erdogan expects will happen than I am of what Trump will do. But Erdogan,
As
right?
with most things, because Trump is
Yeah,
very unpredictable.
yeah. Erdogan, I see right now. Erdogan is the potential biggest winner in Syria. He is the guys he trained and armed and equipped and financed are the guys who threw the Assads out. Now, there are several different groups. They don't necessarily like each other. So it'll take a certain amount of heavy lifting on the Turkish part to get them to cooperate. But and he will accept American help, and he will expect American help coming through Turkey, so that he shows up. Both he picks up a commission on the stuff coming through, and on top of that, he decides who gets what help, so he is in a position to control Syria. This is what he expects, and he expects Trump will back him on this. The wild card is Netanyahu. Netanyahu has just raised the cost of rebuilding Syria by conducting an air campaign that has probably done about $20-30 billion worth of damage. Not just to military equipment, but when you bomb a ship in a port, it means you're also bombing the port, blowing up factories, blowing things like that. So they're doing tremendous damage. So they're raising the cost of rebuilding Syria. And secondly, they're moving into the south. What I see right now, and this I believe, is that this quote buffer zone that Israel is creating in Syria and in Lebanon is actually an extension of Israel, a repeat of the West Bank, and let's go ahead and in 10 years' time, it was all part of what God promised Abraham,
Sort of a greater Israel project.
the greater Israel project. And I think he sees this, and Netanyahu sees this not only because he's a sociopath, but also because he sees it as the one way to get reelected. Because if he can, if he has picked up another, 20,000 square miles, he's a hero, and he's a hero to the far right and the religious nationalists, and it'll kill the peace now people even more. And then they're going to start sending settlements into southern Syria and settlements into southern Lebanon. And these people are going to be his people until he gets too old to, until he dies in office from winning elections. This is his view of life. And that's going to run up against Erdogan, whose first official demand is the territorial sovereignty of Syria. So I think we are going to have a crisis very quickly once the new Syrian government under Turkish influence settles in
You
Damascus.
one thing I always hear, and people push back on me when I talk about Turkey and Israel, people always say it's all just rhetoric with Erdogan. He'll talk a sort of anti-Israel game while Turkey is still doing business with Israel. But I do think there are actual real emergent
Well,
tensions
actually, they're no
between.
longer doing business.
Right.
Erdogan is one of the things is when you create an enemy, uh, you've got to keep it up because you've created an enemy in order to have uh, political support. And Erdogan had two enemies. At first, he had an enemy in Greece and Cyprus on one hand, and then he had an enemy in Israel. And I think someplace along the line, he sensed that 80% of the people of Turkey hate the Greeks, but 90% of the people in Turkey hate the Israelis more than they hate the Greeks. So right now he's actually making nice with the Greeks. I don't know how long it'll last. And the Greek defense budget is over 3.5% because they don't know how long it'll last. But he's actually making nice. There haven't been incidents in the Aegean. The rhetoric is down. The foreign ministers are meeting on a regular basis. Nothing is being decided, but the atmosphere has improved at a time when the atmosphere with Israel has been getting worse and worse and worse. So I just wrote an article that's going to get published on the weekend that says that to me the real worry in what's happening in Syria is that we're allowing two countries that are ostensible allies of the United States to maneuver themselves into a potential confrontation.
So you think that could happen? There could be confrontation between Turkey and Israel over Syria.
Over Syria, yeah.
I've had that thought too, but I haven't heard many people mention it.
Yeah.
So I'm glad that you're.
At first I was saying it'll just be a lot of noise, but now, I mean, if the reports are to be believed, the Israelis have pushed it within 20 kilometers of Damascus. They're going way beyond the buffer zones, way beyond the UN neutral zones. And at the same time, in Lebanon, they are the politicians in Lebanon, Israeli politicians, are talking about we need to have a buffer zone to the Litani, which is 30 kilometers in, and in the meantime, that's really part of Eretz Israel. That's really part of the covenant. And I don't know, Damascus is part of the covenant in the minds of a lot of Israelis of that ilk, people who follow that stuff. So Netanyahu's got a problem too. This is the only issue that's going to get him reelected after the disaster of Gaza. So he needs to make it look like he's expanding Israel to stay in power, and Erdogan needs to get him back across his border for his own purposes.
I see. In closing, and maybe you already answered this, but I was going to go back to the beginning when you laughingly said, everyone's getting it wrong when they were talking about Assad's overthrow and what it means when you were in Doha.
Yeah.
And I was going to ask you to elaborate on that, but I guess in a way you've already answered what you think people are getting wrong about it, or is there anything
Yeah,
else?
it wasn't so much wrong. They were getting it wrong before, and all of a sudden, everything everybody believed disappeared. It was like this big cloud of smoke, and they thought the Assads were in there forever. They didn't think that the guerrillas in Idlib could fight their way out of a paper bag. They didn't realize that the Russians and Hezbollah and the Iranians made exactly the same mistake in Syria that we made in Afghanistan. They did all the heavy lifting, bore all the responsibility whenever the his Syrian army got in trouble. You know, air attacks and so forth, and they didn't realize that they were inducing corruption in the Syrian army, the same sort of corruption that made the Afghans disappear when the Taliban came for. Troops, a battalion was supposed to have 600 men and it actually had 300. The remaining 300 hadn't been paid in months. Their food was falling behind. It was everything. Troops were foraging because there was no threat because the Russians could take care of the threat in Syria, and there was no threat in Afghanistan because the Americans could take care of the threat when it got really serious. And we knew that. That's the worst part. We knew that. And we just didn't do anything about it. And I think the Russians knew it, and they didn't do anything about it. Corruption is the worst thing that can happen. Large scale corruption is the worst thing that can happen to a country.
Well, I want to thank you, Patrick Theros, for returning to Parallax Views. I always enjoy the conversation. Hopefully, we'll do it again in the future. And
Thanks
uh,
always.
and my listeners can find your work at the National Herald.
Okay.
Next up, antiwar.com's Dave DeCamp returns to discuss the latest developments in regards to the events unfolding in Syria. If you're unfamiliar with Dave's work, he does the newswire for antiwar.com, and regardless of your view on the latest geopolitical developments, that newswire is a real resource. It's not the same as an op-ed section, it just delivers the news about various geopolitical developments. Dave is very good at bringing it all together, focusing on the most important stories with regards to geopolitics, and as such, I thought it was a better time than ever, given what is happening, to have him back on the show. And with that in mind, let's get right to the conversation. Welcome back to Parallax Views. Dave DeCamp of antiwar.com. He's a regular guest on the program. He's sort of the intrepid journalist, reporter for Antiwar. He collates all the latest news and gets it out there into the world at antiwar.com. How are you doing?
I'm good, JG. Thanks for having me back.
So the reason I wanted to have you back on the show is, of course, Syria, the fall of Assad, this Syrian rebel group, HTS. A lot of people are wondering, well, how are they going to govern? Is it going to be a jihadist regime? Is it going to be an ultra-conservative regime that is still ultra-conservative but has moved away from jihadism? I think a lot of people are wondering what exactly is going to happen to Syria. What do you think the flashpoints are right now that we should be paying attention to are?
I mean, that is the big question, is how is HTS going to lead this new government that they're trying to put in place? One thing that's important to understand is that there's a lot of other factions involved. You know, in the east, in the northeast, you have the Kurds, the YPG, or the SDF, as they've been renamed by the U.S. They control a good amount of territory there, and there's U.S. bases there. And then in the northeast, in the north, you have the Syrian National Army, which is these Turkish-backed groups, which HTS is backed by Turkey, but not as overtly. And HTS, for those who don't know, I'm sure you've gone over this before, but they are basically an offshoot of Al Qaeda. Their leader, Al Jolani, was the leader of Al Qaeda in Syria, the Nusra Front, and he rebranded in 2016. The way that I've even myself described it before in my coverage of this is that he had a public split from Al Qaeda. But if you actually look back at what he said and what Al Qaeda said at the time, he said, "Oh, I appreciate everything Al Qaeda has done for us, but we're going to change our name here and not be affiliated anymore." And there's a statement from Al Qaeda from somebody who was supposedly Zawahiri's deputy at the time that, "Oh yeah, we support this decision. We think it's the best thing for the global jihad." Basically, it was a rebranding campaign to get support from the West. And I do think there's probably some truth to what Jelani says, that he doesn't want to target the West. He doesn't want to launch terrorist attacks overseas. He wants power in his own neighborhood. But the thing is, among HTS and this coalition of Islamist groups that were ruling over Idlib and now are in charge in Damascus, there's all different factions. And for now, he seems to be keeping them in line, at least in, Aleppo and Damascus. From what I hear, people who have family there,
Real quick, if I could,
uh
with regards to HTS, I think the one thing that I'm very certain of, and maybe you can confirm or push back if you disagree, but I think the one thing I'm sure of is this is a Sunni Islamist political and paramilitary organization. This is not going to be HTS is not some bastion of liberalism, I guess, is what I'm getting at. And I think people need to recognize that, because I see that going around now. Oh, it's HTS has become very liberal. I don't think that's true. They may not engage in terrorism, but I think it's very bizarre, this idea of liberal HTS.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you're right. That's what they are. They're a Sunni Islamist group. And essentially, I think the best we could hope for out of them is that they don't go around and crack down on minorities and implement, a really strict version of Sharia law. There's been all these rumors about what's happening on the ground, but as far as I understand it from people and we're talking about Aleppo and Damascus.
These are the friends you were mentioning you had in the region, or?
Yeah, I have a friend who has family that are Christians in the region. And basically, they've been kind of huddled up in their apartments since this HTS takeover. People aren't working. They're not doing any. They've basically been told not to do any displays of their faith, no Christmas celebrations publicly. But as far as I know, there's been no order for women to veil, wear a hijab or anything like that. But then outside of those areas, we've seen, kind of these executions happening. And it's not really clear who these guys are that are doing this, if they are HTS or if they're one of the other groups. But that does seem to be happening in other parts of the country. Former government supporters being killed, being executed. Can
you talk more about that? I think you wrote an article about it. I saw Josh Landis from Quincy was posting videos about this. What exactly happened? Because I have not read up on it I as much as I should have.
Well, that's the thing, is that it's tough to know exactly what's happening because a lot of it is social media. These videos get put out. It's tough to know what's real, what's not. But there's been reports from news outlets that have sources on the ground of Latakia, specifically the port city, of fighters affiliated with HDS executing former Syrian government or military officials. Also, rumors of the Syrian National Army, which again is the Turkish-backed coalition executing people in the Kurdish areas. And so again, we just don't have a exactly clear idea of how widespread it is, but it is definitely happening. And Jelani's saying that they're gonna, any Syrian government officials that were responsible for torture are gonna pay, and there's gonna be, and the question is, okay, are they gonna have trials for them, or are they just gonna, string them up? But you hear what Jelani's saying, he did this interview with CNN, and he's saying, there's going to protect the minorities, and that it's going to be a Syria for all Syrians, and that they're going to, institutions are important and everything. And they formed this, they picked a prime minister who was the leader of the HTS government in Idlib, which is the province they've controlled since 2017. And Biden actually said when he came out on Sunday with his statement about the overthrow of Assad, which he celebrated, he said it was, great and everything, but he did say, oh, some of these groups have a history of, terrorist activity, but he said they're saying the right things right now. And that's referring directly to HTS, which is designated by the U.S. as a terrorist group, and Julani, who again was the leader of Al-Qaeda in Syria, was a deputy of al-Baghdadi, the former leader of ISIS. I mean, that's where this guy comes from. And basically the U.S. is saying, we're willing to play ball with you if you, I'm not sure exactly what the requirement is from the U.S. If it's just don't go around chopping people's heads off. Because it still does seem like what we've seen from Jelani. He gave a victory speech saying it's going to be an Islamic nation, saying the Mujahideen fighters are victorious and everything. So yeah, we'll see how it shapes out, I guess.
Those executions that we're hearing about in Latakia, I mean, to me, that's very worrisome just to start out, even if they are not like innocent army officers from the Syrian Arab army. I mean, the question is, well, don't they deserve trials even if they are guilty? So I think people should keep an eye on that. But like you said, it seems very murky right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And it does, it's not clear if it's like a top-down order or anything. But, this is a concern for the people, because there's also been videos of Damascus of these trucks driving by with all these fighters, and some of them have the black flag, the ISIS flag. So Jelani seems to be keeping them in line for now. But I think there is the risk that things could get really bad for the minorities in those cities.
And he's not the only player in all of this, is the other thing we have to mention.
Yeah, but as far as I understand it, under the coalition that he led, he's the leader, and nobody's really going to mess with him. As of now. But you never know. I mean, like you said, there's all these different factions. One of them that's interesting is the Turkestan Islamic Party, which is a group of Uyghur Muslims from Xinjiang, the Chinese province. They've been in Syria for a long time now. They're just another that just an example of one of the factions. Their stated goal is to establish an Islamic State in Xinjiang in China. So, it just shows all the different, there is kind of a foreign aspect to this. I know there's some I think a Chechen group as well. So, but for now, I do think
there's too many variables right now, or, I hate to use this phrasing, but there's so many unknown unknowns that, could just make things go in one direction rather than the other in, the blink of an eye.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the strikes we're seeing, so the U.S. has done strikes. Israel, I think you reported, has said that it has launched 480 strikes since the fall of Assad. And of course, we have Turkey doing strikes as well. What should we know about this?
So the U.S., as far as we know, they say that they launched pretty massive airstrikes on Sunday, the day that like Assad officially fell, or, the day after. And the U.S. said that they targeted ISIS camps, but they launched, they hit 75 targets. They used heavy bombers, B-52s and everything. Haven't seen a clear picture of what actually happened on the ground. Didn't see anything really contradicting them saying that they targeted ISIS. So that's basically all we know about that. I mean, the Pentagon didn't even put out any kind of estimate about casualties or anything so far. And then Turkey, is frequently bombing the Kurds in northeast Syria and northern Iraq, and that includes the U.S.-backed forces. I mean, it's just a whole mess. But it looks like they're, the Syrian National Army, they want to get them to kind of take more territory from the Kurds. And so it's just, that's also a big question mark, is how are they going to settle things? Is that just going to be kind of what it's been, this continuous kind of low-level conflict that's kind of always going on? And then what Israel's been doing, I mean, like you said they launched 480 strikes. They bombed Syria nearly 500 times in 48 hours, which Israeli media said is the heaviest Israeli bombing of Syria of all time. And it looks like they hit military targets, the old government's military. They've really wiped it out. And this is coupled with Israel taking Syrian territory. They first took this buffer zone between the Israeli occupied Golan Heights, which they seized from Syria in 1967 and then
Right, and
annexed in
they've since
1981.
annexed it. Yeah,
Yeah,
in what year?
81.
Right, right. And
And
it's
nobody
that I was going to say the annexation I think was officially recognized under Trump. And
in
then,
2019, yeah.
right.
And that's the US is the only country that's recognized it. So the way it was set up, it was like the Israeli occupied Golan Heights, and then there was a buffer zone that was patrolled by UN peacekeepers, and then on the other side is Syria. So they took the buffer zone, but they also went beyond the buffer zone, and they're taking other areas. So you have a land grab happening with these massive airstrikes. And, Netanyahu is very happy about the regime change. He took credit for it. He said that they set off the process that led to the ouster of Assad. And he's definitely right to an extent because the war against Hezbollah, which Hezbollah was a major ally of Assad, really decimated them. And Israel's been bombing Syria for years, but since October 7th, they ramped things up. And then just in the past few months, they ramped things up even more. And the U.S. Was supported those strikes. We don't know exactly to what extent, like if they provide intelligence or anything for Israel. But when Biden listed the actions, the things that the U.S. did to help overthrow Assad, he mentioned the sanctions and supporting Israel's freedom of action. And that was, part of the campaign against Assad. So the U.S. and Israel are very happy with the result, even though this al-Qaeda linked group has taken over. And Israel's kind of using that now as their excuse to bomb Syria as they are and take this land. And, Israel does not have a history of giving back land that it's occupying. So, I think this is something that they're going to try to hold on to, is this territory that they've captured.
Do you think this could come back to haunt Israel in any way or no? I mean,
Well,
with regards to, I mean, how do you think HTS is going to respond to this? I've heard that there's lines of communication being opened up now between HTS and Iran. At least there's like some initial reports of that.
Oh, yeah. I haven't seen that. So, the big thing here is the reason why the U.S. and Israel wanted Assad gone and Iran out of there was because it disrupted, the weapons shipments to Hezbollah and everything. And you have HTS, which is kind of openly hostile to Iran and Hezbollah. One thing Giuliani, said in his speech was that Assad let the country become a haven for Iranian greed. He said something like that. Israel, and there's also reports that they've been in contact with Israel, that they want relations with Israel, but we haven't seen any official statement from HTS. We've also seen videos of some of their members saying that the next stop is Jerusalem, that they're going to liberate the Palestinians. Because it is like, there's so many different dynamics here. They are a Sunni Islamist jihadist group, and, part of their whole thing is wanting to take out Israel, liberate the Palestinians. But on the other hand, Israel has kind of been a strategic ally for them in taking out Assad, which everything I just mentioned before. And it's kind of amazing that Giuliani hasn't said anything about Israel bombing Syria, taking this territory. We haven't seen any statement from the new HTS-led transitional government. But I
That
think
video, by the way, of Giuliani talking about we're going to liberate Jerusalem next. I think that's an older video, and I think he's also
yeah,
said like our enemy is not Israel, it's Assad and Iran. So it just seems like this guy is all over the place in some ways.
yeah. No, I know the video of Giuliani saying that is old, but there was a video that just came out yesterday of some HTS guys saying that. But again, that's not Giuliani. So, it is it's tough to know what he's going to do. But I also think Netanyahu, by bombing Syria, it's like he's saying he wants relations with the new regime, but is bombing the country 500 times how you get that and taking territory. It's kind of making it more likely that whatever government forms is going to be hostile to Israel. But I think he doesn't really care. He just wants them to be completely neutered, to not be a threat at all. because he doesn't want any pushback to what he has planned for Gaza. I mean, what's happening in Gaza today, but what they really want to do in the West Bank and then Gaza when it comes to building settlements and stuff. The only thing that could impede that was Hezbollah and Iran. So this is a big victory for Israel in that sense, because even if, say, the HTS government does take a pro-Palestinian bent to it, it would take a long time before they can build up any kind of force that could threaten Israel.
So I just wanted to put this out there so people don't think I was talking out of my butt, but this is from the New Arab. You don't have to comment on it, but I just want to mention it. Assad allies, Iraq, Iran, moved to open channels with new Syrian administration. Iran and Iraq, strong supporters of the former Syrian regime, have made moves to mend ties with the new government in Damascus following the overthrow of al-Assad last week. And I mean, I've only seen the New Arab report this, so I don't know what to make of it. Like I said, everything is very murky right now, and I think we're gonna just have to stay tuned. Is there anything that you have a hawk's eye for noticing things that aren't necessarily being covered by other outlets? What do you think people are missing, or what is the mainstream media missing in the developments in Syria right now?
Um, well, so that's interesting, and you reminded me. I actually did see that report, and I think it is a fact that you had Assad just kind of completely, the government just melt away so quickly. It's not like there was a big fight. So I think the only option for Iraq, for Iran, is to just try to have some sort of relationship with this new government. But as far as the things that the mainstream aren't covering, I mean, the whole situation is just so kind of absurd. One thing that people missed was during the HTS offensive on Damascus and Aleppo, the U.S. backed a Kurdish offensive in the east. They tried to take some territory from the Syrian government, and the U.S. backed them with artillery fire and airstrikes. I think kind of the U.S. occupation of eastern Syria is a big factor here, and the U.S. is going to have kind of a lot of say in this new government. And it's clear that they don't care about this guy's Al Qaeda and ISIS history as long as they play ball with, basically do what the U.S. wants. And a big part of that is going to be not forming ties with Iran, I think. I think the U.S. and Israel together are going to work to prevent that. I mean, that is what this is all about. Like the U.S. preferring Al Qaeda to Assad and Iran. It's because Iran and Assad threaten Israel. I mean, it's just, that's what this is about. That's why, Scott Horton yesterday, he debated General Wesley Clark, who was once the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. And he's kind of most well known for he's speaking to Democracy Now! He said after 9/11, there was basically this list of 7 countries that they were going to try to take out. First Iraq, then Syria, then Libya, then Somalia, Sudan, Lebanon, and then finally Iran.
Right, and Iran is the only one left out of those now.
Yeah. And so Scott brought that up. It was really something, and he said, this is based on this strategy called the clean break, which the neocons in the 1990s drew up for Netanyahu, for Israel. And it was this whole master plan to take out Iraq and then do this and do that. And he basically got Wesley Clark to admit that, this was the idea, and it was drawn up by the neocons on behalf of Israel. So I think that's something just for Americans to understand. It's like, you see people ask that question. I saw Michael Knowles from the Daily Wire asked, why do we prefer Al Qaeda to Assad? And the answer is, it's Israel. It's what Israel prefers. And that's just what this is all about, really. This idea that Iran and Hezbollah, the Shia, have to be our enemy. It's just not true.
I was just arguing, or not arguing, but I was talking to another friend of the show about this. But it's interesting. I don't really have any love for the Islamic Republic of Iran. I know people from Iran that have been oppressed under that regime, but in terms of like the countries I'm concerned about in this region, I'm much more frightened by a state like Turkey, to be honest, because it seems to back, very radical elements in the Arab world, and yet our biggest concern is supposed to be Iran. Whereas, like, I mean, I think Turkey has much more, I mean, neo-Ottoman sort of ambitions that make it kind of a thorn in the side of everyone in some ways. What do you make of Turkey's role in the region?
Yeah, I mean, we don't know exactly the extent of it, but there were reports from Western media like AFP, the French news agency, that said Turkish intelligence gave the green light for this offensive. And, Erdogan, a few days before Damascus fell, he said, like, pretty ominously that, oh, Assad doesn't want to make a deal. They're going to Damascus, basically, was what he said. The rebels are going to go to Damascus. And then they did. So I think Syria is a big player in this. And, you see all this rhetoric from Erdogan against Israel and what they're doing in Gaza. But then he goes around and takes out one of Israel's biggest problems. And, I think it does go to show that it's very clear looking at what he's done over the years, interventions across the region, supporting Azerbaijan taking over Nagorno-Karabakh, that he has all these designs. And Turkey's a NATO ally with U.S. nuclear weapons stationed in it. So there's always that risk of like Turkey and Russia fighting. Not that I mean, Turkey's kind of an outlier in NATO. I don't think like a clash between Turkey and Russia in Syria would mean NATO's going to intervene. But yeah, it's definitely he's got expansionism on his mind. I think he wants to make Northeast Syria part of Turkey. I think that's pretty clear.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think he definitely wants to get rid of the Kurds. In terms of, have you heard any reports about Ukraine in regards to all of this?
Well, I just wrote something up based on what was in the Washington Post. So there's been all these reports about the Ukrainian intelligence going to Idlib and helping HTS and training them. And this has been reported by Russian media and Ukrainian media, and then just yesterday by the Washington Post. David Ignatius, who's known for kind of his contacts in the CIA, said that a few weeks ago, Ukraine's military intelligence sent about 20 drone operators and a few hundred drones to HTS right before this offensive. And this is something that the Ukrainian military intelligence, they've said that they've been involved in attacks on Russian bases in Syria. And so it's basically more confirmation that Ukraine is involved. And, that's HTS, again, is an organization considered a terrorist group by the U.S. So here you have Ukraine's military intelligence, which the CIA really helped build up after 2014, giving material support to this group that the U.S. considers a terrorist organization. So it's kind of just a mess. But, they're involved to some extent. If that really made any kind of difference isn't clear. It's hard to say. But, yeah, the Ukrainians were on the side of HTS against Russia's ally. And you see how Biden, again, when he made his big announcement, he credited U.S. support for Ukraine and Israel for the downfall of Assad, saying, that it hurt his allies, that they couldn't defend him.
Do you think, I mean, what are your biggest concerns going forward when it comes to the region and U.S. involvement? Because I know neither of us can look into a crystal ball, but like, where do you think the biggest concerns are right now?
Well, I mean, it seems like the risk of an Israel-Iran war has gotten much less. I mean, I think Iran has shown that it can't really do too much to Israel. They did show that their ballistic missiles could hit Israel, get through the air defenses, but they're not gonna. They know that if they really hit Israel hard, that means war with the U.S. And now with Hezbollah really getting hurt and Assad being taken out, Iran has just become, I think, much less of a threat to Israel.
I mean, it's not completely isolated yet. It still has Iraq, but I mean, yeah, it's been, I think it's weakened.
Yeah. And I mean, because if they, didn't do anything that big when they had Hezbollah, whenever, I just don't, they're just not in a position of any kind of strength right now, I would say. But the problem with that is that's going to, I mean, Netanyahu, I think, is totally emboldened right now. And I think what we're going to see from this Trump administration, one thing Israel's been doing kind of quietly almost because barely anyone has noticed in northern Gaza, they're carrying out this ethnic cleansing campaign where they're forcibly displacing all the civilians and then going in there and demolishing all the buildings so they have nowhere to go back. Israeli settlers are on the border. Some of them have gone into Gaza to scout settlements. I think we might see settlements pop up soon. And I think with the Trump coming in, his ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, if that's any indication, they're going to strongly back Israeli settlement expansion, probably even in
What was it that
Gaza.
Jared Kushner said? He
So
said it'll make a good beachfront property.
good beachfront condos, yeah. And I think just with Israel so emboldened now, they're just going to go ahead with this, and we're just going to see more death in Gaza, which is still every day. So many people are being slaughtered, and so there is a chance of, I don't know. I mean, this blowback against the U.S. for supporting this. Possibly in the form of an attack here in the U.S., whether it's an organized group or it's just a single person. That's always a risk. And I do think that the U.S. is going to stay involved. I mean, there's also the war in Yemen, this bombing campaign that Biden started. I don't think that's going to end. I think there's a chance Trump could even ramp that up. It's just all like such a mess. And Syria, it could descend into a really nasty civil war. That could be a result of this. And then you have those bases in eastern Syria, the U.S. bases. They're basically like sitting ducks. So there's always the chance of them getting hit hard. And then the U.S., if American troops die in any incident, it's going to escalate U.S. involvement more. So the whole thing, it's just a mess.
What do you think the best we can hope for is with regards to the Syria situation? I mean, is it just a matter of we have to hope that al-Jilani can sort of keep control of the more radical elements, or?
Yeah, I mean, I guess so. I mean, that is the hope that he is actually, a moderate rebel now or a moderate leader now, and that it doesn't descend into the crackdowns that we might see, or that they do form some kind of government between all the different factions that gets it and everybody gets a say. But again, that's just so hard to believe with considering who's in charge of this thing. But and if that happens and the U.S. lifts sanctions, I mean, that's the best thing that could happen to Syria because their economy has just been completely destroyed.
Before we close out here, what do you make of this incoming Trump administration and just the way in which, I mean, I think he went, he did sort of a night of the long knives against the America First foreign policy faction that backs MAGA. I'm saying that as an outsider because I don't consider myself in any way affiliated with MAGA. I'm very critical of it, but I just think he really threw the sort of realist and restraint wing of MAGA under the bus. I mean, what's your analysis, though? Agree or disagree?
Yeah. I mean, with his foreign policy picks, he absolutely did. Like Marco Rubio for Secretary of State. I mean, that's about as bad as you can get. But the one thing, is that he did campaign on ending the war in Ukraine. You could say that he didn't articulate how he was going to do that and that it's not really clear if he's going to do it, but he did campaign on it. He campaigned on ending that war. And even a lot of these hawks that he's put in these positions, Mike Waltz, who's going to be his national security advisor, I see him in interviews saying that they're going to bring an end to the war. They're going to make a deal. Of course, the problem is what kind of deal are they going to make? You have this guy, Keith Kellogg, that he made the envoy to the conflict, who's been a Russia hawk, who's criticized Biden for not intervening enough in Ukraine. But he's also saying he wants to make a deal. I don't think any of the offers he's laid out are realistic to Russia, but I think there is a chance that we could see like a ceasefire in Ukraine and then negotiations start. I think that would be the move anyway, is just like stop the fighting, stop the killing, let's talk. I think that's the one bright spot here. I think in the Middle East, with this Republican-controlled Congress, with this administration, I mean, the one thing that they all have in common, even the ones who are marginally better on some things, the one thing that all the Trump picks have in common is that they are hardcore Israel supporters, Zionists, And I think it could get really ugly. I mean, you have Trump saying he wants the war to end, but he's also saying, Israel needs victory. They need to finish the job. And finishing the job for Israel is getting all the Palestinians out of Gaza or killing them all. And then the West Bank, they all see this as an opportunity to advance annexation in the West Bank. I mean, I think the Middle East policy is going to be really ugly. And then they're all China hawks. I mean, that's another thing. Even the ones like J.D. Vance, who are less hawkish on Russia, it's all because they think we should be more focused on China. And that's kind of a whole nother thing that's going on. But again, I think the one bright spot is Ukraine. And I think even though he's put these hawks in his cabinet, it seems like something's going to change with Ukraine when he comes in.
I think even Zelensky has himself sort of said that in media interviews that people can expect the war to end in 2025. I think it's going to be very interesting if there's negotiations, because I think right now what a lot of people aren't taking into account is that, I mean, both Ukraine and Russia are starting out with maximalist demands that they have. And more power to them. I think that's just normal for states to do that when they're in a war. These are our demands. And it'll be interesting to see in negotiations, if they happen, how those demands get whittled down on both sides. But it's certainly, we live in interesting times with all of this stuff, as the Chinese proverb goes.
Yeah, it will be. I am curious to see what's going to happen. The change in guard, But yeah, it's coming up soon, about 40 days till his inauguration.
Anything else I missed here that you want to get in real quick? And how can my listeners keep up with your work?
One thing I just want to kind of articulate a little more. I mentioned Yemen. I covered a story yesterday about U.S. Navy destroyers and commercial ships coming under a Houthi attack in the Red Sea or in the Gulf of Aden. This kind of bombing campaign since January, the U.S. has been bombing the Houthis in defense of Israeli shipping. That's why they started it. And the situation has only escalated, and the Houthis aren't backing down. So this is something I've just been kind of thinking about lately, that I could see Trump coming in, even though he might have an instinct to end wars in some scenarios. He's going to look back on his ISIS campaign of just obliterating them in Iraq and Syria. And if someone in the Pentagon comes to him with a plan saying, hey, if we just really ramp up these airstrikes in Yemen, we're going to get them to stop, that he might sign off on something like that. So that's what I meant by that. But yeah, anyway, besides that, all my writings at antiwar.com, I write in the news section. You could listen to my show or watch it on YouTube. It's called Anti-War News. It's on YouTube, Rumble, Odyssey. You could listen to the podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, and then follow me on Twitter or X at DeCamp Dave.
Hey, real quick, you mentioned Islamic State, and I should have mentioned this earlier. Is there a possibility of an Islamic State resurgence in Syria?
Yeah, I think so. I think definitely they could take advantage of this, and maybe some of the more hardline guys in HTS or all these other groups might want to merge with them. That's definitely if they think Giuliani's too much of a moderate.
Well, thank you again, Dave DeCamp, for coming on Parallax Views.
Thanks for having me.
Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. I hope you enjoyed the conversations on this edition of the show. As always, if you can, please support me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight. with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.